so you're beginning your reading of the next section of Huck Finn in Lesson 2, and that's chapters 7 through 11. So far you've really just been through the exposition of the novel. Now we're going to get to the actual adventures of Huckleberry Finn from the title. So if you'll remember from your previous reading, Huck is stuck with Pap, and Pap's a good-for-nothing kind of man, drinks away his money and doesn't really care for Huck, but does want to control him. And chapter 7 begins just after he actually tried to kill Huck in this rage, probably some kind of drunken rage in the middle of the night. So he wakes up, sees Huck with the shotgun poised, because that's what Huck was using to protect himself from Pap the night before. Of course, Pap doesn't remember any of that, and Huck makes up this extravagant lie. He said somebody was trying to break in. And as things go along, Huck essentially comes up with a plan to break out, to escape from Pap. He decides he doesn't want to go back to Miss Watson, doesn't want to live that life either, but this life with Pap's not for him. He wants to be his own man. So he creates this hole in the wall, comes up with this elaborate scheme, and makes it look like, he essentially fakes his own death. And he escapes to Jackson Island. And that's where our adventure begins. So you can read all about that in chapter 7, all right, his great escape. And that brings us then to chapter 8. So chapter 8 begins with Huck, and he's on Jackson Island. But he finds out somebody else is on Jackson Island with him. Who could it be? It turns out that Jim, Miss Watson's escaped slave, Huck comes to find out, is there. Now, Jim brings a lot of humor to the story, but he also brings one of the central conflicts to the story, and that is the issue of race. And how Huck relates to Jim is very important. So continue to watch their relationship. Watch how Huck treats Jim. Because even though he's a kid, in this time period, he represents a white male. Okay? And Jim, of course, a slave. And so the idea is, how does Huck respond and treat Jim? Interesting, Jim does bring humor to it. He's very superstitious, so you can see that. He's also very loyal, fiercely loyal. So lots of interesting things with their relationship. Don't miss out on the irony. You know, Jim talks about how in this chapter he loses his money. He once was a rich man, but he lost all of that money, and by rich he had like 14 bucks. But then he says that if he owns himself now, and Miss Watson was going to sell him down the river, and by the way, being sold down the river, you've heard that phrase before. It actually came from during slavery. The further south you went, it was known that the people who owned slaves were harsher. So as a slave, you wanted to be farther north up the river. Those were nicer. Usually slave owners there were nicer, so you would have a nicer life as a slave. But the farther south you went, the worse your life would be, essentially. And so Jim is afraid of being sold down the river, quite literally. So keep that in mind too. But anyway, he makes the comment, and you've got to, hear the irony of Mark Twain saying this, that he now owns himself, and since Miss Watson was going to sell him for about $800, then Jim is a rich man, because he's worth $800, and he owns himself. So effectually he has that money in his way of thinking. So interesting concept on value there. Chapter 9 then begins with Huck and Jim are kind of getting along. They're on the middle of the island. They kind of set up camp. And everything seems to be going pretty well, except for one thing. Jackson Island isn't that far from land, and they can't go out in the daytime because people would be able to see them, and their cover would be blown, essentially. Even though nobody's looking for Huck because they think he's dead, people are looking for Jim. And here they keep getting into more adventures. A house drifts by, And because it was flooded and caught down the river, they go in, they find a dead body, okay, secretive kind of stuff going on. They collect supplies, take it back to the island. So it's all about how are they surviving, what's happening to them, lots of little mini adventures. In chapter 10, we have kind of some sad things and some tension in the relationship between Jim and Huck. Again, they're just kind of going through their supplies they gathered from the house. Jim's got a lot of discussion about superstition. One of the things he's talking about is how bad luck rattlesnake skin is, or snake skin of any kind. And Huck decides to play a prank on Jim. And this isn't going to be the last practical joke that he plays on Jim. And so he kills a snake, puts it in Jim's bed, thinking just to scare him. The problem is Huck forgets about it. And Jim doesn't go to bed until later that night. Well, in that time, another snake has come to where that snake was. So there's now a living snake there. And Jim gets bitten. He almost dies. It's really bad. And Huck feels bad about it, okay, which is an important point, especially in that race discussion. He is chastened. He feels bad for what he did. Okay, he doesn't want Jim to suffer on account of his doing. Now, it's a temporary feeling, mind you. Like I said, it's not the last practical joke that Huck's going to play on Jim, but it is something interesting to kind of watch and pay attention to. The other thing that happens here is that they need news about what's going on. What's the gossip about Huck Finn? Have they bought it? Do they all believe that he's really dead? What about Jim? What are they saying about him? Well, Jim can't go into town and ask, and so Huck doesn't want to go into town where he'll be recognized, so they decide to dress Huck up like a girl, and they got this dress off of that house in the last chapter, so we're getting kind of crazy and fun. Lots of adventures here. So Huck's going to dress up like a girl and go into town and see if he can find out the latest gossip. So this last chapter that you read for this segment, chapter 11, is a pretty humorous one. Huck's dressed like a girl. He goes to this new home where someone's just moved in, so they're less likely to recognize him, and he finds out all the scuttlebutt. What are people saying about him? What are people saying about Jim? And some of that's pretty surprising and pretty sad. It seems like Jim's taking the blame for a lot. What's happening with Pat? Those questions are all answered based on gossip. Remember, he's pretending to be a girl here, and he's talking to a woman. Problem is, he's not such a good girl, okay? And so this whole chapter is about him being found out, all right? The woman that he's visiting with kind of figures that he's a boy, and so she starts testing him to see what he'll do. So pretty hilarious chapter. Turns serious at the end, because he finds out that Jim's in danger, that they are sending people to Jackson Island. They suspect that people are hanging out there. So the end of the chapter is Huck hightailing it back to try to save Jim, which is really pretty interesting. The fact that he feels the need to do that. Okay. The other thing is, just kind of overall, as you're reading through these segments, what I would recommend is that you go ahead and you look at your assignment, your multimedia project, because you have some topics that you're going to want to be tracing. For example, one of your topics is conflict between civilization and the natural life. That would be, what's the difference in the depiction of this setting on Jackson Island, that's natural life, versus in town, like in this chapter when Huck goes into town. What are the differences there? One of them is defining honor or morality. The fact is, Huck lies all the time. And yet, somehow, he seems to be one of the most moral characters in the novel. So how does that work? Food and shelter. There's a lot of discussion over food and shelter in these chapters, and supplies even. So who is gathering the food? What happens with the food? How do they find shelter? Where do they get it? What are the requirements for that? And how does it affect their lives? Okay, and so what's the commentary on that? Superstition, all over the place in these chapters. So great resources for that topic. Who is superstitious? Jim, obviously, but what about Huck? Does he have superstitions? He doesn't always seem to believe Jim's, but on the other hand, Do they really have bad luck because of what some of the things that they do? So looking at that, looking at his lies, we talked about that. All of this is discussed is set on the Mississippi River. So Mississippi River as an important symbol in the novel. What does it mean? And looking at that, looking at money and class. That'll probably come into play a little bit later in the novel, but you do see differences between like Miss Watson and Pat here. What are some family models? You know, Huck and Jim, they're not family, but they act as one, okay? They form a kind of family unit, even though they're not actually blood related while they're out on their adventures. So kind of looking at them as a sort of family structure, but if that's the case, who's the parent, who's the child? That gets a little blurry. And you've got a couple more that you can choose from, but those are the main ones that get discussed in these chapters. So I would encourage you to go ahead and be looking at those, making notes, marking the passages that deal with the topic you want to pursue, so that as you get busy on your multimedia project, you don't have to go back and reread looking for those things. You can find them as you go along. So hope you enjoyed these chapters. Lots of good things to be thinking about, and I'll catch you on our next lesson.